Hey everyone, welcome back to Web Dev Junkie. My name is Cody Seibert, and I'm going to be showing you how to set up a React app with Redux and Redux Thunk. And I'm kind of going to talk a little bit about it and why you'd use it and how to use it, and then kind of walk you through how to set it up from scratch. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I'm going to do is just go ahead and create a basic React app. So I'm going to use npx create-reate-app. Haven't used this before. Basically, it just generates you an app. So in a terminal, I have my working directory set to workspace, and I could just go ahead and make a new app called, I don't know, React Redux Thunk tutorial. So when I run that, it's going to fetch all the packages necessary to kind of run a simple React app. And while that is fetching and installing node modules and stuff like that, let's go ahead and move forward to looking at the Redux package. So Redux is what we're going to be using to kind of use a centralized store. If you don't know what a centralized store is, basically, you know how in normal React you have stateful components where you keep track of state in a component, and you pass that state around into nested components, etc. Well, as your application gets larger and larger, it gets kind of hard to manage state when you have to keep passing it down, down your DOM tree or your component tree. And then sometimes you need these subcomponents to like modify state. So, how do you do that? How do you have a subcomponent go back up the tree to the parent component and change state? And it just gets a little bit unmanageable. So one solution is to use Redux to have like a single place where you keep track of your application state. And then you can dispatch something called actions that run reducers and modify your state, etc. We'll kind of cover all that in a second. But right now, this is still running. I think it's almost done. But yeah, so we're going to be using Redux for, keeping track of application state. And sometimes, at least what we do in our project, we put everything in our Redux store. Like every single piece of state is pretty much put in your Redux store. And the reasoning for that is it kind of allows you to totally decouple from whatever front-end library you're using. Like, since everything is in our Redux store, it's very easy for us to kind of totally strip away React and use something like Vue or Angular, because all of our application logic lives in a separate layer. All of our state lives in a separate layer. So if I just go through all my components, none of them really have state. So it's very easy to just swap them out with a different front-end library or framework. But I mean, obviously, you're never actually going to do that. Once you pick React, you're probably not going to switch over to anything else. So the second thing that we're going to be looking at is Redux Thunk, which is a middleware function or helper that you can use on Redux to allow you to do asynchronous functions or asynchronous actions. And what we mean by that is basically, you know how in a web app you typically need to talk to a web API or GraphQL and get some type of data from a service. Well, unfortunately, for whatever reasoning, the people who made Redux decided that they weren't going to support async actions, which means you have to download yet another package so that you can do asynchronous actions that kind of call a backend. It's not too hard to set up. It's actually pretty straightforward as long as you follow the docs, but it's just another thing you kind of need to keep track of, which is kind of disappointing in my opinion. But hey, that's just how the React ecosystem is. So without further ado, let's just go ahead and open up code to that project folder. So I'm going to load a VS Code. We have that project folder that we just set up with create-reate-app. And one thing you can do is you can just do npm start, and that should host your React app. And we'll see in a second, it should be hosted on some type of port here. There we go. Let's see. All right, so we got a React app running using create-reate-app. Nothing too special there. So let's actually start making a really simple stateful component, which I can increment a counter. Like that is the classical example that they use on a lot of tutorials So basically just have a button, you click it, and a count goes up. So let's just go ahead and strip out all this stuff, save it, and that should refresh our React app, and we should see the changes show up here. So let's just say testing, save that, and it shows up. Okay, so what we wanted to do is we want to make this app component. So if you know anything about React, this is a functional component where we can use hooks to get state, and then we basically just export it so we can use it later on. And that is used later on here, line 7, where we say render that app component into the document root. So nothing too extravagant there. But what we want to do is we just want to make a button, and inside that button, we want to have it have some type of count. So I'll just set it 5 for right now. So in React, if you're using functional components, you have the ability to use hooks to pretty much keep track of state. So what I'm going to do here is inside of my import statement, I could say use state, and that is one hook that is available to us, which allows us to kind of define some state. And in order to use a hook, basically you just call it, and then you pass it some initial state value. So in this case, if we wanted our initial state to be like 5, we could pass it 5. And then on the left, you need to have that pretty much, this will return an array with 2 elements. So in ES6, you could simply just say const array and then define 2 variables here. So I could say the first element of that array is the actual state variable. So I'm going to say count. And then the second element is a method you can use to modify the state. So typically you do like the state, and then you do a set state name. This is a convention, but this can be named whatever you want, and this can be named whatever you want. But now that we have those, what we can do, get rid of the logo here, is you can render out that state inside your component using these curly braces. So if I go back, notice that the button says 5 here. Let me zoom in a little bit for people who have bad eyes like me. So I'm going to zoom in, and we can see that the button changes to whatever that state initial hook value is, right? So pretty straightforward. And then what we want to do is if we click on the button, so on click, all we need to do is just call a anonymous function that sets the count to count plus 1. So again, this is a method that you can call, which basically modifies your state. So by doing this, it should increment our count by 1 every time we click it. Okay. Okay, so that is, the way you do it using React and React hooks and stateful components in React. So again, like I said, as your application gets larger and larger, this becomes a little bit unmanageable because you end up having to pass either like this function or the state down inside your nested components, and those nested components might have more nested components that need the state. Then you might have layers and layers and layers of nested components that need to modify the state later on. So it makes it a little bit hard to manage, and one approach that you can do is, there's use context, which you can kind of wrap your app, and all the children would have access to a context that they could change. And that is kind of a new feature in React that, could potentially replace Redux, replace your centralized store. But it's a different approach, and if you enjoy using Redux, you can still use Redux. So what I'm going to be showing you here is how do you set up to kind of get that centralized store, to use Redux, to have your state not live in the components, but instead live in another file. So let's go ahead and go back to the Redux project, and let us just kind of walk through what we need to do. So there is a lot of documentation on Redux, which is unfortunate because it's actually a really simple library. It's like, for a beginner, having to read through all this and seeing all this new terminology can kind of be overwhelming. So let's just kind of, break it down to make it a little bit easier to understand. So first, let's just install Redux. And what makes it suck is that in order to use Redux, you have to also use something called React Redux to be able to connect to it. And the reason is this Redux has no knowledge of React, right? Redux is just a standalone library that has absolutely no knowledge of React. So if you want to use Redux inside React, you also need to install something called React Redux. So I'm just going to go ahead and install that as well when this is done installing. But while that runs, since my internet seems to be super slow, we can go ahead and start setting up our Redux store. So there is a method called create-store, which we can use to create our store. So if I go into my source project and just make a file called store, we can import that method called create-store. And the way the store works is basically you provide it something called a reducer, and that is going to listen to actions, and based on what actions you dispatch, you'll change the state. So I'll walk you through this, but let's just go ahead and copy some code. So we import create-store from Redux, then we call create-store with a reducer, which I haven't defined yet. I'm going to say root reducer instead. And we need to make sure we define a root reducer. So let's just go ahead and say const root reducer is equal to a function that takes in state as a parameter. Okay, and what else do we might need here? So these are just examples of how you do it. We don't necessarily need this. So what we can do is, instead of doing that, let's just do export default create store. That takes a reducer. And the important thing is we need to kind of talk about what the reducer is, but I guess I could do that now. So again, Redux, you have a store, and basically the store state is only able to be modified via these reducer functions, okay? And what the reducer function basically does is it takes in an initial state. So, state changes over time. You have state of, I don't know, T0, T1, T2, and then every time you dispatch an action, your reducer is going to be invoked. And the responsibility of this function is basically just return the new value of your state. So as an example, let's say our state starts as, I don't know, count of 0. And one thing you can do is you can actually say state is equal to initial state here. So I'm going to say const initial state is equal to an object that has count of 0. And up here, I could say state is equal to initial state. And this is how you kind of initialize your state with a default value. So starting off, state will be null or undefined. And then as you fire off dispatch actions, this will fire for the first time and then set your state to, this. So if you're not already confused, let's just go ahead and step forward. The second argument of the reducer is your actual event. To go back here, they call it an action, so I'm going to actually call it action. But typically what you do in your reducer is you do a switch statement, and you need to check the type of action, right? So inside your actual view layer, inside your React components, you dispatch something called actions, which are basically just objects that have a type property. And depending on the type that was dispatched, you want to change the state. So in this case, let's just say default, which is your default case statement. We just want to return state, okay? Default. And then up here, you can actually check if the action was set to something, you could do something else. So this is a really basic reducer that basically just keeps returning state over and over again. No matter what you dispatch, whatever action you send, it's just going to return count of 0. So basically our state can't change, but you need to make sure that your reducer has a default, or else it's going to set your state to null or undefined, okay? Okay, so now that this is done installing, and that took a whole year to install, we can go back and we need to install something called React Redux. And this is so that we can actually connect this store to our React components. Because again, Redux is kind of agnostic in terms of what UI library you're using. So while that is installing, and hopefully it doesn't take a super long time, we have to go into this npm project. So yet again, another npm project. And let's look at the docs there. Go to quick start guide. Okay, we install it, or it's probably installing still. But, okay, so the first thing we want to do is React Redux provides you a component called provider. And what you basically do is you need to wrap your main top level app component with a provider which takes in a store as a property or a attribute or whatever you want to call this thing. So what we can do is just go ahead and copy that code. Okay, that's done installing. Awesome. And go back to our index.js. Remember, this is where we render our app component, and just paste that in there. So we have a provider that takes in a store. And notice that we don't, have access to provider or store yet because we haven't imported it. So let's go ahead and go up here, say import provider from React Redux. And then store is in that file we just created called store. So let's just import store there. And now we have the app component wrapped with a provider that has a store. And what does that mean? Well, basically it means that our app component has the ability to take in some things from props. The first thing it has is a dispatch function. And I do believe this is in the docs. So let's see. If I go here, actually you might have to call connect first. You know what? Let's just not step forward yet. Let me just see if, I just want to double check that we do get dispatch here. I'm not sure if you probably have to call connect first, but we'll see. Okay, so it's undefined. So I think you do need to call connect. So React Redux provides you with another helper function that you have to kind of wrap your React components with. So in this case, you have a function called connect. And what you can do is down here where you're exporting your app component, you call connect, and then you call it again and pass it your app, right? And I believe I can just not pass it any arguments just to kind of show you that you get dispatch here, but I could just be going off a bad memory. So, okay, so notice here you have, now that we've called connect, you have the ability to call something called dispatch, and that is how you dispatch actions, okay? But let's not get down into those weeds yet. What we want to do right now is we also need to connect our store to our component. Taking a step back, we have the connect function. It takes in two arguments. It takes in a map state the props argument, and it takes in a map dispatch the props argument. So these are kind of helper functions that you can use so that you don't have to like write a lot of code inside your actual component. Let me see if I can just get state here. I think you might be able to, probably not. Who knows? Undefined. Okay, so the first one, map state the props. Okay, so this is a function which basically is used for mapping your Redux store to your properties that are passing up here. So ignore that. That was not actually something we can do. But basically, if you remember in our store, we have a property called count. So if we want access to that count store property, what we can do in this map state to props function is just basically say count is going to be returned in this object, and it's going to map to state.count. Okay? And then to actually use it, you just pass it in as the first argument to your connect function. And we can also clean this up and you do like, some ES6 style of functions. So if I do this, just makes it a little bit cleaner. But now what we can do is we can actually no longer use the hook. So if I get rid of use state and delete that, the onClick we will do later. So let's just delete that for now. I'll just have it return null. But the important part is the property. So I could name my count here if I wanted to. The property that you have access to that maps to your store's state variable is provided to you as a property. So I can go up here and change that to my count. And if I save this component and go back to my React app, notice that the value is 0. And just to kind of further demonstrate that, I could make this 1337. And now notice that the React component has been connected to our store. Okay, so that was, pretty straightforward. There's a lot of stuff that you had to kind of set up, but once you get it set up, it's really easy to, go forward. So the second part is, how do we dispatch these actions? Well, one approach is you have dispatch available to you as a property up here. So you could just do dispatch and then pass it an object that takes in a type. So I'm going to say increment count. Okay. And so let's take a step back. Inside Redux, there's something called actions, and those actions fire off, and then your reducers, so in this case, this function, again, listens for actions of certain type and changes the state based on what was fired off. So if we want to increment the count by 1 when we get an action called increment count, we just add that to our switch statement, and we need to make sure we return some new state which has the count incremented by 1. So what I could do here is I could say return count of state.count plus 1. Okay. And when your object is larger and larger, some approach is you just do ... state, and then you modify the actual property that you want. So in this case, let's start initial state back at 0. Let's save this file, and we should be able to go back and click the button. Okay, so notice that the store is incrementing the count by 1. Okay, so that, honestly, that pretty much covers most of what you need in Redux, but I'm going to go ahead and keep taking it a step further. There is another property you can pass in to connect called map dispatch the props, which if you provide it some action creators, it's going to automatically just provide those as properties. So what do we mean by that? Well, let's just go up here and let us make a new file called, I don't know, actions. This is just for the example. You probably want to split up your files and name them a little bit different as your app gets larger. There's something called like the duck pattern. I personally like just having a folder that says actions and then reducers, stuff like that. But the choice is yours. The freedom is there for you to do whatever you want to do. So let's talk about something called action creators. So the issue with this, where I just have this dispatch hard-coded with a type, is that if your app is, let's say, 1,000 components, and you have hundreds of components that need to dispatch the same action, this is not really clean code, right? You have this type hard-coded everywhere throughout your app, and this is considered like a magic number or, a magic variable. So one approach that you can do is something called action creators, which is a paradigm that the people who made Redux suggest you take. And what this is basically, it sounds confusing, but really it's just a function that returns this object. So if I export a constant called increment count action, that is a function which returns type of increment count. Okay, that is an action creator. Takes in some type of arguments and returns you the object that has your type. Okay, super straightforward. It sounds confusing, but really it's just a function that returns this. Okay, so to use it in this example, you could just simply import it from your actions file. And instead of saying dispatch of that, I could just call it, right? So let's save this and make sure that this still works. Okay, so that should have been pretty straightforward. We didn't really do much. We just pretty much abstracted away the action object and put it inside a factory function. Okay, but let's take this a step further. So unfortunately, this is kind of verbose. Like calling dispatch all throughout your app is a little bit verbose. So the connect function takes a second parameter or argument, which basically allows you to not have to do this. It'll allow you to just call a function directly and then call this dispatch stuff behind the scenes. Okay. So if we do map dispatch to props and we set that equal to an object, one thing you can do is you just set the the key equal to the same as your action creator. I think you can actually change this. So I could say like increment my count here. I could be wrong about this, but what you need to do is pass it in as a second argument to connect. And now inside of your app component, instead of having to bring in dispatch, all you need to do is just bring in bring in that property that you've defined here, and you can just call it directly if you want. Okay, so now I can say on click, create or increment my count, and I think this should work. Okay, so I click on this and it's incrementing correctly. So this right here, this is the clean version of using Redux with your app components. Okay, we basically have the ability to dispatch actions and bind to the state. And we have your actions, which are action creators, which return objects. And another way, an additional thing you can do to clean this up is typically these. If you see here, this increment count string is kind of split up between the store and the actions. And again, you could dry this up by just exporting a constant called increment count. And instead of having that a hard-coded string, you could just use it there. And then inside your store, you could simply import that from actions and use that string inside your case statement. So if I save that, go back and make sure this still works. So that is, all in all, like the clean way to set up. And again, the splitting up of your actions and your reducers and stuff, computeds or whatever, you probably want to read up on a good project structure for doing that, because just having them all inside your store, all inside your actions isn't the best approach as your app gets larger. But I mean, you'll run into that as your app grows, and you'll figure out a good approach that works for you for organizing your files and your state and your actions and your reducers. Okay, so that covers React stateful components, and then we refactored to use Redux. And then we basically have an issue, okay? So inside web applications, you often need to hit a REST API. But unfortunately, you can't really do asynchronous functions inside your action. So if I had an action that needed to fetch some data from a backend, you can't really do that well using actions. So we need to bring in something called Redux Thunk, which is a middleware for Redux. And it sounds confusing. Again, tons of docs that they hit you with starting off, but it's really straightforward. So let's just install that. So if I go in here, npm install save Redux Thunk, and then wait another 5 years as my internet churns, we can then use that inside of our React Redux app. So if we go here, I mean, you can read through these docs and they might help you, it might explain it better than I am, but basically it allows you to have your action creators return a function that has a dispatch. So we'll see that in a second, what I mean by that. So what do we need to do to set it up though? Okay, installation. Basically, there is a apply middleware function that is provided from Redux. Is that Redux or React? Yeah, Redux. So if I go to our store and I pull in something called apply middleware, we can call that function when we're creating our store. So down here, we say create store, we pass a root reducer, and then we need to call apply middleware, and we need to pass it thunk, okay? So I'll bring in thunk here, and I will call thunk with apply middleware, and that's all you got to do. You're pretty much done setting it up. So at this point, what this allows us to do is, let's say increment count actually needs to call a backend and increment some count on a server that keeps track of that in Mongo, and then that might take half a second and that gets returned. Well, you can't do that with Redux out of the box. That's why we installed Redux Thunk. But in terms of what changes, literally all you need to do is just have your action creator return a function. Okay, so that's all I did. I just added another fat arrow here, and this takes a dispatch, and it can also take a get state as a second parameter. And just to verify I did that right, let's just go ahead and go up. So this is our action creator. It returns a function that has a dispatch and a get state. So what we can do is, to kind of give you an example, is inside of our function that's returned, let me just add curly braces, we could just dispatch that object here. But let's say behind the scenes, we actually need to like listen or call the API endpoint. So let's pretend we have a service called count service, and that is going to call a backend. But let's just pretend there's a backend. There's not really going to be a backend. So I'm just going to say return new promise. I'm going to resolve set timeout of a second. And what can I do here? I could just call resolve. Okay, so let's pretend, use your imagination, that this calls an API endpoint to increment or count. And I think I'm missing a parentheses. Okay. Okay, so what you can do in your action is you can import that service. So increment count comes from count service. And what we could do inside of our action creator is we just await on that. And then when that's done, we could just dispatch our action. Okay, so now, assuming I set this up correctly, when I click the button, it should wait a second, a full second, and then it should increment. So I clicked it, waited a second, and it went forward. Clicked it, and incremented. Clicked it, and incremented. So this is just a really basic example of why you use Thunk. Obviously, let's say there's a endpoint that, or let's say this returns the new count. So I'm going to say const new count is equal to await increment count. So this is a better example of using like a REST API. You call an API such as like, I don't know, get users, and that returns you an array of all your users, and typically you need to set that on your store. So let's say instead, increment count actually takes in a payload. I'm going to say new count. And let's say that, you know, I'm just going to, this is all just silly code, so I don't have to spin up a backend. But every time you resolve count plus plus, every time you call this, basically it's just going to increment your count. And we're going to pretend, again, this is like happening on the back end, right? So what we did instead is we changed the increment count action to take in a new count, which is going to be returned from your service. So inside the store, we go to that reducer. Remember, action should have your type, and it should also have your payload. So what we could do is just say action.payload. And now it's kind of not incrementing the count. Technically, it's setting the count. So I could just change this to set count, but just for the sake of this tutorial, we'll keep it as is. But what I'm trying to kind of explain is this is the approach you typically do when you're hitting like a REST API. You get some stuff back, and then you need to set it onto your store. Okay, so if I click on this, again, it waits a second, and then it actually didn't work this time. Let's just verify that the new count is being set to what we expect. Okay, so let's click on this, wait a second. New count is 0. New count is 1. Oh, it did go up. Okay. I guess I just didn't save the file. Okay, so I click it. After a second, it takes 2 clicks. There's a little bug. But you get the idea, I hope. Why is that happening though? Let's see. I think because it starts at 0 and then it starts at 0 again. Sorry, I gotta fix this. This is gonna bother me if I don't fix this. Okay, so let's just do plus plus count. So it increments it first, and then it returns it. So plus plus, boom, there we go. Okay, so I mean, at this point, I covered basically everything you might need to know. There is, as your application gets larger and larger, sometimes you want to split up your state into separate reducers. So there is a method available to you called, I think it's called like combine reducers. Let me just make sure. So in Redux, there's a combine reducers function where you basically just pass in an object with all your nested state properties, and each one has a separate reducer. So this is what you want to do as your app gets larger and larger, is you don't want to have like a switch statement with 1,000 different case statements inside of it, right? Instead, you want to kind of have count be like a count reducer. And then let's say you want like a users to be a users reducer. And then based on what actions are firing off, these reducers will only change that nested state property. And that is a way to kind of keep your code a little bit cleaner. And you can look into this. It's as simple as this. You just have different reducer functions, and then your top level properties will change based on those reducers. Okay, so I mean, read through that. I could probably make a different tutorial about that. But this tutorial wraps up how to set up React using stateful components, and then we refactored to use Redux, and then I kind of explained why you want to use Thunk if you want to do asynchronous actions. If there's anything I left out or anything that was confusing, feel free to, send me a question in the comments below, and I can maybe explain that or just make a new video. But I think that kind of gives you a good overview of how you do Redux. It's kind of intimidating at first. There's like so many different libraries you got to install, and you got to set them all up. And that's one thing I hate about the React ecosystem, is that like just to do something simple, you got to install like 5 different packages. But it's a blessing and a curse, right? It gives you the flexibility and freedom to choose whatever you want and use it in your package. But at the end of the day, as a beginner, the less you have to worry about setting up, the easier it is. But again, it wasn't too much. I mean, the docs are pretty good. You can follow them. You literally just set up a provider in a store, make a reducer, make an action, and then connect it to your component. That's all you do. So again, if you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, because I'm going to be posting a lot of videos like this in the future. And also give me a thumbs up, and be sure to leave a comment. Like, even if it's just a silly comment, the more comments you leave, the better the video gets in terms of exposure. So be sure to leave a comment. All right. Again, thanks for watching. This is Web Dev Junkie, and my name is Cody Seibert. Have a good day.